The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest great story humanity ever wrote, and it opens with a king in Uruk who has everything except wisdom. Gilgamesh is powerful, feared, and out of control until the gods create a rival to stop him. That collision ignites the greatest friendship in all of literature, and a quest driven by one hunger that never goes away: the desire to outrun death. If you want a new story to fall asleep to every day, subscribe now, and you'll have the next journey waiting for you tomorrow night. The epic begins in the great city of Uruk, one of the world's first urban centers. Rising from the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Picture massive walls stretching toward the horizon, their mud brick surfaces gleaming in the desert sun, protecting a population that had never before been equaled in human history. Within these walls lived tens of thousands of people engaged in the complex dance of civilization itself. Merchants hawked their wares in bustling marketplaces. Craftsmen shaped clay and metal into objects of beauty and utility. Farmers brought their harvests from the surrounding fields, and priests performed elaborate rituals in towering temples that reached toward the heavens like artificial mountains. But all was not well in this magnificent city, for Uruk was ruled by a king whose power had corrupted him beyond all measure. Gilgamesh was his name, and he was no ordinary mortal. 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, he possessed strength and beauty that surpassed all other men. Yet he wielded these gifts with a cruelty that made his subjects tremble at the mention of his name. The ancient tablets describe him as tall as a cedar tree, with arms like pillars and eyes that could pierce a man's soul, but they also speak of his tyrannical nature, his insatiable appetites, and his complete disregard for the welfare of those he was meant to protect. This king took whatever he desired without thought or consequence. No bride could reach her wedding chamber without first enduring his attentions. No young man could escape the endless demands of his construction projects and military campaigns. The people of Uruk worked themselves to exhaustion building monuments to their king's glory, while their own families suffered in poverty and despair. Day and night, the sound of hammers and chisels echoed through the city as workers labored to satisfy Gilgamesh's megalomaniacal visions of grandeur. The suffering grew so intense that the people could no longer contain their anguish. They raised their voices to the heavens, crying out to the gods who had created their tormentor, begging for relief from their oppression. Their prayers rose like smoke from countless hearths, carrying with them the accumulated grief of an entire population pushed beyond endurance. The gods, dwelling in their celestial palace, heard these desperate pleas and recognized that their creation had become a monster that threatened the very fabric of civilized life. In response to these prayers, the gods conceived a solution that would either destroy Gilgamesh or transform him into something worthy of his divine heritage. They would create a man to match him in strength and ferocity, a wild creature who could challenge the king's supremacy and force him to confront his own nature. This being would serve as both mirror and opposition, showing Gilgamesh what he had become while offering him the possibility of redemption through conflict and eventual friendship. The task of creation fell to Aruru, the goddess of birth and fertility, whose hands had shaped the first human beings from clay at the dawn of time. Deep in the wilderness, far from the corruption of civilization, she gathered mud from a sacred pool and began to mold a figure unlike any that had ever walked the earth. As her divine fingers worked the clay, she breathed into it not just life, but all the wild power of untamed nature itself. Hair like a lion's mane, muscles like twisted rope, fingernails sharp as claws, and a heart that knew no fear of man or beast. This creature she named Enkidu, and when her work was complete, she cast him into the deepest wilderness, where he would learn to survive among the animals rather than among men. Enkidu ran with the gazelles across endless steppes, drank from the same streams as the wild cattle, and slept beneath stars that had watched over the earth since before human civilization began. He knew nothing of cooked food, woven cloth, or spoken language. His world consisted entirely of sensation and instinct, the immediate reality of hunger and thirst, warmth and cold, safety and danger. For years, Enkidu lived this way, growing stronger and wilder with each passing season. He learned to communicate with animals through gesture and sound, to find food and shelter in the harshest conditions, to defend himself against predators with nothing but his bare hands and primitive tools. The animals accepted him as one of their own, recognizing in him a purity and innocence that civilized men had long since abandoned. He became their protector, warning them of human hunters, destroying the traps that men set for them, filling in the pits that threatened their safety. Meanwhile, in the civilized world, hunters began to report strange occurrences in the wilderness. Their carefully laid snares were found destroyed, their prey mysteriously warned away, their hunting grounds rendered barren by some unseen force. These men, who depended on the hunt for their livelihood, found themselves returning home empty-handed, again and again, their families facing hunger, while some unknown saboteur frustrated their every effort. One hunter, more persistent than the rest, decided to solve this mystery that was threatening his very survival. He ventured deeper into the wilderness than any man had gone before, following tracks and signs that seemed to belong to no known animal. For days he searched, sleeping little and eating less, driven by desperation and the need to understand what force was working against him. At last, his patience was rewarded. At a waterhole where animals came to drink at dawn, he witnessed something that filled him with both terror and wonder. A figure emerged from the morning mist, walking upright like a man but covered in hair like a beast, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to belong more to the wild creatures than to any human being. The hunter watched in amazement as this strange being communicated with the animals through gestures and sounds, warning them of dangers only he could perceive, guiding them to safety with the care of a shepherd tending his flock. The hunter realized immediately that this wild man was responsible for all his troubles, but he also understood that here was something far beyond his ability to handle alone. This creature possessed strength that could snap a man's neck like a dry branch, speed that could outrun the swiftest horse, and senses so acute that he would detect any human approach long before an ordinary hunter could get within striking distance. Direct confrontation would mean certain death. Yet something had to be done to end this interference with the hunt that sustained so many families. Returning to Uruk with his incredible tale, the hunter sought an audience with King Gilgamesh himself, hoping that royal power might provide a solution to his impossible problem. He described what he had witnessed in the wilderness, painting a picture of a creature that seemed to embody all the strength and freedom that civilized men had traded away for the security of walls and laws. As the hunter spoke, a strange light entered the king's eyes. For here was a challenge unlike any he had ever faced, an opponent worthy of his divine strength. But Gilgamesh was cunning as well as strong, and he understood that brute force alone would not be sufficient to deal with this wild man. Instead, he devised a plan that would use civilization's most powerful weapon against the innocence of nature itself. He would send a temple priestess into the wilderness, a woman skilled in all the arts of seduction and pleasure, who could offer Enkidu something that his animal companions never could. Human desire, once awakened, would forever separate him from the simple world he had known, making him vulnerable to capture and ultimately transforming him from humanity's enemy into its ally. The woman chosen for this delicate mission was Shamhat, a sacred prostitute from the temple of Ishtar, goddess of love and war. These temple women held positions of great respect in Mesopotamian society, trained not merely in physical pleasure, but in the deeper arts of human connection and spiritual transformation. Shamhat possessed beauty that could stop a warrior in his tracks, wisdom that came from years of service to the goddess, and most importantly, the patience required to accomplish what no hunter's spear or trap could achieve. Together, the hunter and Shamhat made their way into the deepest wilderness, following the paths that led to Enkidu's favorite watering places. They established a hidden camp near the spot where the wild man was known to appear each morning, settling in to wait with the focused determination of those who understand that some victories can only be won through careful timing and perfect execution. For 3 days they maintained their vigil, watching as various animals came and went from the waterhole, but seeing no sign of their quarry. The hunter began to worry that his plan had somehow been detected, that Enkidu's supernatural senses had warned him of their presence. But Shamhat counseled patience, reminding him that creatures of the wild moved according to rhythms that civilized men had forgotten, and that haste would only ensure their failure. On the 4th dawn, as the first rays of sunlight painted the desert horizon in shades of gold and crimson, their patience was finally rewarded. The animals arrived at the waterhole in their usual procession, but today they were accompanied by the figure that had haunted the hunter's dreams. Enkidu emerged from the shadows like a force of nature given human form, his massive frame moving with the fluid grace of a predator, his wild hair catching the morning light like a lion's mane. The hunter's breath caught in his throat as he observed this creature up close for the first time. Every story he had told about Enkidu's size and strength had been an understatement. The wild man stood nearly 7 feet tall, his body sculpted by years of surviving in the harshest conditions, his muscles rippling beneath skin that had been tanned to leather by sun and wind. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as something beyond ordinary humanity, for they held a depth and wildness that spoke of perfect harmony with the natural world. Shamhat studied this magnificent being with the calculating gaze of a master craftsman examining raw material. She understood immediately that traditional approaches would fail utterly with such a creature. Enkidu existed in a state of pure innocence, untouched by the complex desires and fears that motivated civilized men. To reach him, she would need to awaken something that had never stirred within his wild heart, something that would make him question everything he had ever known about himself and his place in the world. As Enkidu knelt beside the waterhole to drink, Shamhat made her move. She stepped from concealment with deliberate slowness, allowing her robes to fall away as she approached the water's edge. Her appearance was calculated to present humanity at its most alluring, beauty enhanced by art and artifice, the promise of pleasures that the natural world could never provide. Enkidu's reaction was immediate and profound. He leaped back from the water as if it had suddenly burst into flames, his entire body tensing for flight or fight. But something held him frozen in place, some new sensation that his wild upbringing had never prepared him to understand. For the first time in his life, he experienced desire not for food or shelter or safety, but for connection with another being who walked upright as he did. Shamhat spoke to him in soft, musical tones, using words he could not understand, but whose meaning penetrated directly to his heart. She moved closer with each gentle phrase, her hands extended in gestures of invitation and comfort. The animals that had been drinking peacefully at the waterhole began to grow nervous, sensing something in their protector that they had never encountered before, a change that threatened to sever the bonds that had united them for so many years. When Shamhat finally reached Enkidu, she placed her hands upon his chest and felt the wild hammering of a heart that had never known human touch. For 6 days and 7 nights, she taught him the mysteries of human passion, showing him pleasures that transcended anything the natural world could offer. During those hours of intimate connection, something fundamental shifted within Enkidu's consciousness, as if a door had opened in his mind that could never again be closed. The transformation was not merely physical, but spiritual and intellectual. As Enkidu learned the language of human desire, he simultaneously began to lose his ability to communicate with the animals that had been his family. The gazelles that had once run beside him now fled at his approach, sensing that he had become something foreign and dangerous. The lions that had once accepted him as an equal now viewed him with suspicion and hostility. when the seventh dawn broke over their improvised bower, Enkidu attempted to return to his old life among the wild creatures. But the change in him was so complete that they no longer recognized him as one of their own. His scent had altered, carrying the complex fragrances of human civilization. His movements had lost their animal fluidity, becoming more deliberate and self-conscious. Most importantly, his eyes now held a spark of awareness that separated him forever from the pure instinct that governed all other living things. Shamhat watched with satisfaction tinged by sadness as Enkidu struggled to understand what had happened to him. She had accomplished her mission perfectly, transforming this wild man from an enemy of civilization into a potential ally. But she also recognized the profound loss that her success represented. Enkidu had possessed something that no civilized human could ever reclaim, a perfect harmony with the natural world that was perhaps humanity's greatest sacrifice in the pursuit of knowledge and power. Seeing his distress, Shamhat began to speak of the world beyond the wilderness, painting pictures with words of the great city of Uruk, with its massive walls and towering temples. She described the wonders of human civilization, the arts and sciences that men had developed, the complex social bonds that replaced the simple relationships of the animal kingdom. But most importantly, she spoke of Gilgamesh, the king whose strength and beauty surpassed all other men, presenting him as a worthy companion for one who had lost his place among the beasts. Enkidu listened to these descriptions with growing fascination and anger. The more Shamhat told him about Gilgamesh's tyrannical rule, his oppression of the weak, and his contempt for justice, the more Enkidu felt a burning need to confront this king who so abused the gifts the gods had given him. Here was a purpose that could replace his lost connection to the animal world, a mission that would allow him to use his strength in service of something greater than mere survival. But first, Shamhat explained, he must learn to live as men lived, to eat cooked food and wear woven cloth, to speak in words rather than gestures, to understand the complex rules that govern civilized behavior. This education began immediately, as she produced bread and beer from her traveling supplies and taught him to consume these products of human industry rather than the raw flesh and water that had sustained him in the wilderness. The bread felt strange in his mouth, soft and yielding where he was accustomed to tearing meat with his teeth. The beer burned his throat and filled his head with unfamiliar sensations, but gradually he began to appreciate the complex flavors that human skill could create from simple grains. As his body adapted to civilized food, his mind began to grasp the concepts that Shamhat patiently explained. The ideas of law and custom, of trade and craftsmanship, of the thousand subtle distinctions that separated human society from the brutal simplicity of nature. The transformation took many weeks, during which Enkidu gradually learned to walk and talk and think like a civilized man, while retaining the supernatural strength that marked him as something more than human. Shamhat proved to be a patient and skilled teacher, understanding that too rapid a change would shatter his mind completely. She introduced him gradually to each aspect of human culture, allowing him time to absorb and integrate each new concept before moving on to the next. As his education progressed, Enkidu began to experience dreams unlike any that had visited him during his wild years. These were not the simple nightmares of predator and prey that had occasionally disturbed his animal sleep, but complex visions filled with symbolic meaning. He dreamed of a great axe falling from the sky, too heavy for any man to lift, yet somehow precious beyond measure. He dreamed of a star that blazed across the heavens before coming to rest at his feet, its light transforming everything it touched. Shamhat interpreted these dreams as omens of the friendship that awaited him in Uruk, explaining that the axe and star represented a companion who would match his own strength and become dearer to him than any brother. These interpretations filled Enkidu with anticipation and a strange longing for something he had never experienced. the deep bond between equals that could transcend even the connection he had lost with the animal kingdom. Kingdom. When Enkidu felt ready to leave the wilderness behind forever, Shamat led him toward the edges of civilization, where shepherds tended their flocks in the borderlands between wild and tame. These men lived simple lives, closer to nature than the city dwellers, but bound by the basic laws of human society. They would serve as Enkidu's introduction to communal living, teaching him through example how men could work together for mutual benefit rather than competing like beasts for limited resources. The shepherds received this strange newcomer with a mixture of curiosity and caution. His enormous size and wild appearance marked him as potentially dangerous, yet his association with the temple woman suggested divine purpose behind his arrival. They offered him shelter in their rough huts and invited him to share their evening meal around fires that pushed back the darkness and the predators that prowled beyond the circle of light. Enkidu marveled at these simple manifestations of human ingenuity. Fire that could be controlled and maintained, structures that provided protection from wind and rain, tools that multiplied the effectiveness of human hands. But more than these material innovations, he was struck by the complex web of relationships that bound these men together. They shared their food freely, took turns standing watch through the dangerous hours of night, and resolved disputes through discussion rather than violence. One evening, as Enkidu sat listening to the shepherds tell stories of their daily struggles and small triumphs, a messenger arrived from the city bearing disturbing news. A wedding was to take place in Uruk, but the bride and groom lived in terror of their king's intentions. According to ancient custom, Gilgamesh claimed the right to lie with every new bride before her husband could touch her, a privilege that had transformed what should have been joyous celebrations into occasions of shame and sorrow. The messenger spoke of how the young woman wept in her father's house, knowing that her wedding night would bring violation rather than love. Her betrothed, a good man who had worked for years to earn enough wealth to support a wife, could do nothing but accept this humiliation or face the king's wrath. The entire city buzzed with anger and helplessness. For what could ordinary citizens do against a king who possessed the strength of the gods themselves? As Enkidu listened to this tale, a rage unlike any he had ever experienced began to build within his chest. During his years among the animals, he had witnessed the natural cruelty of predator consuming prey. But this was something far worse. This was the deliberate abuse of power by one who should have protected the innocent, the corruption of strength that should have served justice. The fire that burned within him was not the simple anger of a threatened animal, but the righteous fury of a moral being confronting absolute injustice. He rose from the circle around the fire, his massive frame casting dancing shadows in the flickering light. The shepherds fell silent as they saw the transformation that had come over their guest. Gone was the confused wild man who had stumbled uncertainly through his first lessons in civilization. In his place stood something that seemed to embody justice itself, terrible and magnificent in its determination to right the wrongs that had been too long endured. Without a word, Enkidu strode into the darkness beyond the fire's reach, beginning the journey that would take him to Uruk and the confrontation that the gods had planned from the moment of his creation. Shamat watched him go with pride and sadness, knowing that she had successfully completed her mission, while also understanding that she was losing the most remarkable man she had ever encountered. The wild creature she had seduced beside the waterhole had become something far greater than either of them had imagined possible. The road to Uruk stretched across plains that had been shaped by countless generations of human effort. Irrigation canals carried life-giving water to fields of barley and wheat, their straight lines imposing geometric order on the natural landscape. Villages clustered around crossroads and river fords, their mud brick houses rising like small mountains from the flat earth. Everywhere Enkidu looked, he saw evidence of humanity's relentless drive to transform the world according to its needs and desires. As he walked, other travelers joined and left his path. Merchants driving donkey caravans loaded with exotic goods, pilgrims seeking blessing at distant shrines, soldiers marching in formation with bronze weapons glinting in the sun. Many stared openly at this giant whose wild hair and primitive clothing marked him as something outside their experience, but none dared to challenge him. The aura of barely contained power that surrounded Enkidu was unmistakable, warning potential troublemakers that this was not a man to be trifled with. The closer he came to Uruk, the more densely populated the countryside became. Suburban settlements housed craftsmen and farmers who served the great city's needs, their workshops producing the countless articles required by urban civilization. The air grew thick with smoke from kilns and forges, the roads crowded with traffic flowing in both directions as the economic heart of Mesopotamia drew resources from hundreds of miles around. When Enkidu finally crested the last hill before Uruk, the sight that greeted him surpassed even Shamhat's elaborate descriptions. The city's walls rose from the plain like artificial cliffs, their surfaces gleaming with glazed brick that reflected the afternoon sun in dazzling patterns. Gates tall enough for giants provided passage through these fortifications, their massive doors studded with bronze and flanked by towers that seemed to challenge the heavens themselves. Beyond the walls, the city proper spread across an area that could have contained dozens of the villages Enkidu had passed on his journey. Temple complexes dominated the skyline, their stepped pyramids reaching toward the clouds like stone mountains built by human ambition. Palaces and administrative buildings proclaimed the power of earthly authority, while markets and residential districts buzzed with the activity of tens of thousands of people pursuing their daily lives. The sound of the city was unlike anything Enkidu had ever experienced. Where the wilderness had offered the clean simplicity of wind and bird song, Uruk generated a constant cacophony of human voices, animal cries, hammering, grinding, and construction that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of civilization. The smell was equally overwhelming, a mixture of cooking food, burning incense, human sweat, animal waste, and the thousand subtle fragrances of concentrated human activity. Enkidu passed through the gates among a crowd of other travelers, his extraordinary appearance drawing stares and whispers from the guards. But no one attempted to stop him. Perhaps they sensed that this was no ordinary visitor, or perhaps they simply lacked the courage to challenge someone who radiated such obvious physical power. Whatever the reason, he entered the city unopposed and began making his way through streets that seemed designed to demonstrate the wealth and sophistication of their builders. The wedding procession was already forming in the district where the bride's family lived. Musicians tuned their instruments while dancers prepared their costumes. But the usual joy of such occasions was notably absent. Instead of celebration, Enkidu sensed fear and resignation in the faces around him. The bride herself sat in her family's courtyard, surrounded by female relatives who attempted to comfort her while struggling to contain their own anguish. Enkidu positioned himself where the procession would pass on its way to the temple district, settling into a doorway that would allow him to intercept the royal party when it arrived. Around him, citizens of Uruk went about their evening activities with the forced normalcy of people who had learned to accept injustice as an unchangeable fact of life. Their conversations were muted, their laughter forced, their movements quick and nervous, as if they expected at any moment to attract unwanted attention from those in power. As darkness began to fall over the city, torches were lit to illuminate the processional route. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls and faces of the gathering crowd, creating an atmosphere of unreality that seemed appropriate for the confrontation that was about to unfold. Somewhere in the distance, drums began to beat with the slow, measured rhythm that would guide the wedding party's progress through the streets. The sound grew gradually louder as the procession approached, accompanied by the jingle of bronze ornaments and the shuffle of many feet on stone pavement. Citizens pressed themselves against buildings to make way for the royal entourage, their faces reflecting the complex emotions of subjects who feared their ruler but dared not openly oppose him. Children were pulled quickly into doorways, by parents who understood that royal displeasure could fall on anyone foolish enough to attract attention at the wrong moment. When the procession finally came into view, it was led by palace guards, whose bronze armor and weapons marked them as professionals trained for war. Behind them came musicians and dancers whose performance seemed mechanical rather than joyful, their movements precise, but lacking the spontaneous energy that should have accompanied a wedding celebration. Court officials followed, their rich robes and jewelry proclaiming their status, while their expressions revealed the moral emptiness that came from serving power without principle. At the center of this elaborate display walked Gilgamesh himself, and even Enkidu, prepared as he was for an extraordinary encounter, felt his breath catch at the sight of this legendary king. Everything the stories had claimed about Gilgamesh's physical magnificence proved to be understated. He stood nearly as tall as Enkidu himself, his body perfectly proportioned and radiating the kind of strength that came from divine heritage. His face was beautiful in the way that statues were beautiful, flawless in its symmetry but cold and remote as carved stone. The king wore robes of the finest linen, dyed in colours that only royalty could afford, their surfaces embroidered with gold thread that caught the torchlight and threw it back in dazzling patterns. A crown of electrum circled his brow, its intricate workmanship proclaiming the skill of the greatest craftsman in the known world. Jewelled weapons hung at his side, their hilts wrapped in precious metals, and their blades forged from bronze harder than iron. Every aspect of his appearance spoke of power unlimited by ordinary human constraints. But it was Gilgamesh's eyes that revealed the corruption that had transformed divine gifts into instruments of tyranny. They held the flat, predatory stare of someone who had never learned to see other people as anything more than objects to be used for his pleasure. There was intelligence there, and even a kind of terrible beauty, but no trace of the compassion or wisdom that should have guided one who held such power over the lives of others. As the royal procession approached the spot where Enkidu waited, time seemed to slow to a crawl. The citizens lining the street held their breath, sensing that something unprecedented was about to occur. Even the guards seemed nervous, though they could not have articulated why. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation, as if the city itself understood that a moment of destiny was at hand. When Gilgamesh drew close enough to touch, Enkidu stepped from his concealment and planted himself directly in the king's path. The effect was immediate and electric. The entire procession ground to a halt as guards reached for their weapons and courtiers gasped in shock. No one in living memory had dared to block the king's progress, and for a moment everyone present struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. End what they were witnessing. Gilgamesh's reaction was swift and terrible. His hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword as his eyes locked onto this massive stranger who had committed the ultimate act of defiance. For several heartbeats, the two men stood facing each other in absolute silence, their gazes meeting with the force of colliding worlds. The crowd around them seemed to fade into insignificance as these two beings, each possessing strength beyond ordinary human comprehension, took the measure of one another. The king spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to instant obedience. "Who dares stand before Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, lord of the 4 quarters of the world? Stand aside or face the consequences of your insolence." But even as he issued this threat, something flickered in his eyes that had not been there for many years. Here was someone who did not cower before royal power, someone whose very presence suggested that the king's supremacy might not be as absolute as he had believed. Enkidu's response came not in words, but in action. With movements too quick for the eye to follow, he seized Gilgamesh by the shoulders and lifted him bodily from the ground. The shock that rippled through the assembled crowd was palpable, for no living person had ever laid hands upon their god-king without permission. Guards rushed forward with weapons drawn, but they hesitated when they saw that their lord was in no immediate danger merely held fast by someone whose strength clearly matched or exceeded his own. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense, but rather a contest between forces of nature given human form. The two giants grappled in the narrow street, their struggle sending shockwaves through the surrounding buildings as they crashed against walls and shattered market stalls with their superhuman power. Neither could gain a lasting advantage over the other, for where Gilgamesh possessed the refined technique of royal training, Enkidu countered with the raw instincts learned through years of survival in the wilderness. They fought with the intensity of gods reshaping the earth itself, their combat destroying everything within reach as they rolled and wrestled through the streets of Uruk. Doors splintered beneath their weight, stone pavements cracked under the impact of their bodies, and the very ground seemed to tremble with each thunderous collision. The citizens fled in terror, pressing themselves against distant walls or seeking shelter in whatever structures seemed sturdy enough to withstand the earthquake of this unprecedented conflict. The battle raged for hours, neither combatant able to achieve decisive victory over the other. Gilgamesh discovered for the first time in his life what it meant to face an opponent who could match his divine strength, while Enkidu learned that civilized training could make natural power even more formidable. As the night wore on, their initial fury gradually transformed into something approaching mutual respect, for each began to recognize in his opponent qualities that he himself possessed. When dawn finally broke over the devastated street where their contest had begun, both warriors stood breathing heavily, their bodies marked by the violence of their struggle, but neither definitively defeated. Blood ran from cuts and scrapes that would have crippled ordinary men. Their fine clothing hung in tatters, and exhaustion weighed upon them like a physical burden. Yet in their eyes burned a new light, the recognition that each had found something he had never expected to encounter. Gilgamesh was the first to speak, his voice hoarse from exertion, but carrying a note of wonder that had been absent from it for years. "Never have I met a man who could stand against me as you have done. You fight like the storm winds themselves, with power that comes from the heart of the earth. Tell me your name, stranger, for I would know who has shown me that I am not alone in my strength." Enkidu straightened slowly, his wild hair matted with sweat and dust, his massive chest rising and falling with each labored breath. "I am called Enkidu, fashioned by the gods from clay and given life to challenge your tyranny. I came here expecting to destroy a monster, but I have found instead a man who fights with honor, despite the corruption that has claimed his heart. You are indeed mighty, Gilgamesh, but might without wisdom is destruction without purpose." The king studied this remarkable opponent with new eyes, seeing past the primitive appearance to the nobility that shone from within. Here was someone who could speak to him as an equal, who possessed the strength to challenge his actions, while lacking the fear that made all other men's words meaningless. For the first time since ascending to the throne, Gilgamesh felt the stirring of something that had long been dormant in his soul. "You speak of tyranny and corruption," he said slowly, "yet you have shown me courtesy in combat, holding back the killing blow when you might have taken it. Why did you not destroy me when you had the chance? The gods sent you to end my rule, did they not?" Enkidu shook his head, a gesture that sent droplets of blood flying from his matted hair. "The gods may have shaped my body for war, but they also gave me eyes to see and a heart to understand. In our battle, I saw not the tyrant I expected, but a man who has forgotten what it means to use his gifts in service of others. You fight with skill that speaks of years devoted to perfecting your art, yet you have no worthy opponent against whom to test that skill. You rule a great city, yet you know nothing of the joy that comes from protecting rather than oppressing those weaker than yourself." These words struck Gilgamesh with the force of a physical blow, for they gave voice to feelings he had buried so deeply that he had forgotten their existence. The loneliness that came from being surrounded by subjects who feared him, the emptiness that resulted from having no true companions, the slow corruption that came from exercising power without restraint. All of these truths, had been hidden beneath layers of pride and self-deception until this moment, when Enkidu's simple honesty cut through them like a bronze blade through silk. Around them, the city was slowly coming back to life as citizens emerged from their hiding places to survey the destruction wrought by their supernatural conflict. Buildings would need to be rebuilt, market stalls replaced, and streets repaired, but the physical damage seemed insignificant compared to the transformation that was occurring in their king's heart. Those who had witnessed the battle spoke in hushed tones of what they had seen, scarcely able to believe that their god-king had met his match in this wild stranger from beyond the walls of civilization. Gilgamesh looked around at the destruction they had caused, seeing it through new eyes that had been opened by Enkidu's words and actions. The fear in his subjects' faces, which he had always taken for proper respect, now appeared to him as the symptom of a deeper sickness in his rule. The elaborate luxury of his court, which had once seemed like fitting tribute to his divine nature, now struck him as hollow display that served no purpose beyond his own vanity. "I have been a fool," he said quietly, the admission coming as a shock even to himself. "I thought that strength gave me the right to take whatever I desired, that divine blood freed me from the obligations that bind lesser men. But you have shown me that true strength lies not in domination, but in restraint, not in taking, but in protecting. How does a king learn to rule justly when he has known only the exercise of unlimited power?" Enkidu smiled for the first time since leaving the wilderness, recognizing in this question the beginning of wisdom that had been absent from Gilgamesh's character. A king learns justice the same way any man does, through friendship with those who can speak truth to him without fear. You have ruled alone for too long, surrounded by those who tell you only what they think you want to hear. What you need is a companion who values your welfare above his own comfort, someone who will challenge your decisions when they are wrong and support them when they are right. The suggestion hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning the gap between their different worlds. Gilgamesh had never experienced true friendship, having been isolated by his royal birth and divine heritage from ordinary human relationships. Enkidu had lost his connection to the animal world through his encounter with civilization, leaving him equally alone despite his recent education in human ways. Each possessed what the other lacked: strength that could be matched only by its equal, and loneliness that could be cured only through genuine companionship. "Would you consider such friendship with one who has been your enemy?" Gilgamesh asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability that no subject had ever heard from their king. "I cannot promise that the habits of a lifetime will change overnight, but I swear by the gods who made us both that I will try to become worthy of such a gift." Enkidu stepped forward and clasped the king's forearm in the gesture of warriors acknowledging each other's worth. "I came here to fight a tyrant, but I have found instead a man who possesses the courage to admit his failures. If you will have me as companion, I will help you learn to use your strength in service of justice, rather than in pursuit of selfish pleasure. Together, we might accomplish great things that neither could achieve alone." The crowd that had gathered to watch this extraordinary encounter fell silent as they witnessed their king embrace this wild stranger with genuine warmth. The gesture marked a transformation that would reshape not only Gilgamesh's character, but the entire nature of his reign. No longer would he rule through fear and arbitrary power, but through the wisdom that came from having a true friend who could guide him away from the temptations that had corrupted his earlier years. As the two newly forged companions walked together toward the palace, leaving behind the wreckage of their epic battle, the citizens of Uruk began to whisper among themselves about the changes they sensed coming. The wedding that had been interrupted by their conflict was quietly postponed, not out of fear, but because the king himself declared that such celebrations should be occasions of joy rather than dread. Royal proclamations would soon follow, establishing new laws that protected the weak from exploitation and ensuring that never again would royal privilege be used to justify the violation of innocent citizens. But these immediate reforms were only the beginning of what Enkidu's friendship would bring to Gilgamesh's life. For the first time since his youth, the king felt a sense of purpose that transcended mere self-gratification. Here was someone who could share his adventures, challenge his thinking, and provide the companionship that his divine nature had always made impossible with ordinary mortals. The bond that formed between them in the aftermath of their battle was unlike anything recorded in the annals of human history. It transcended the usual categories of friendship, brotherhood, or even love between man and woman, creating something entirely new that would become the template for all legendary partnerships that followed. They were equals in strength and courage, yet complementary in wisdom and experience, each providing what the other needed to become complete. Within days of their first meeting, the two had become inseparable. They shared meals in the palace halls, trained together in the royal gymnasium, and spent long hours in conversation as Enkidu shared his knowledge of the natural world, while Gilgamesh taught him the intricacies of statecraft and civilization. Their friendship deepened with each passing day, creating a bond that seemed to make both men stronger and wiser than either had been alone. The transformation in Gilgamesh was particularly remarkable to those who had known him before Enkidu's arrival. Gone was the restless cruelty that had marked his earlier reign, replaced by a thoughtful consideration for the welfare of his subjects. He began to seek counsel from advisors he had previously ignored, to visit parts of his kingdom he had never bothered to see, and to involve himself personally in ensuring that justice was administered fairly throughout his realm. Enkidu, meanwhile, flourished in this new environment where his strength could be channeled toward constructive purposes. He learned to read and write, mastering the complex cuneiform script with surprising speed. He studied the laws and customs of civilized society, gaining understanding of how communities could function harmoniously when governed by wisdom rather than force. Most importantly, he discovered that his wild origins gave him unique insights into human nature that proved invaluable in helping Gilgamesh become a better ruler. The palace itself seemed to come alive with new energy, as the friendship between king and companion transformed the very atmosphere of the court. Servants who had once crept through the halls in terror now moved with confidence, knowing that arbitrary punishment was no longer to be feared. Courtiers who had previously competed for royal favor through flattery and scheming began to focus instead on genuine service to the kingdom. Musicians and poets found their creativity unleashed as they were encouraged to create works celebrating justice and friendship rather than mere royal glorification. Yet even as their friendship brought new joy and purpose to both their lives, neither Gilgamesh nor Enkidu was content to remain within the comfortable confines of civilized society. Their extraordinary abilities demanded extraordinary challenges, and the peaceful administration of kingdom affairs, however worthy, could not fully satisfy their need for adventure and glory. They began to speak of undertaking great quests that would test their combined strength, while bringing honor to Uruk and demonstrating the power of their partnership to the world beyond their borders. Their borders. The legends spoke of monsters that terrorized distant lands, of treasures hidden in realms where no mortal had dared to venture, of ancient evils that awaited champions brave enough to confront them. Among these tales, one captured their imagination above all others. The story of Humbaba, the terrible guardian of the cedar forest who had been appointed by the gods themselves to protect the sacred trees from mortal interference. Humbaba was no ordinary monster, but a creature of divine origin whose very breath could wither the strongest oak and whose voice could shatter stone at 100 paces. The cedar forest under his protection lay far to the west, beyond mountain ranges that had never felt human footsteps, in a realm where the trees grew so tall they seemed to support the very heavens. These cedars were more than mere timber. They were the building blocks of divine architecture, the material from which gods constructed their temples and palaces in the celestial realm. For generations, kings and heroes had dreamed of harvesting these legendary trees, imagining the glory that would come to whoever could claim such precious materials for their own construction projects. But the terror of Humbaba had kept all such ambitions in check, for the monster's reputation extended far beyond the forest he guarded. Travelers brought tales of his supernatural senses that could detect intruders from vast distances, of his ability to command the wild beasts of the forest, and of his rage that burned like an unquenchable fire against any who dared disturb his domain. The very mention of Humbaba's name was enough to silence the boldest warriors, yet it was precisely this reputation that made him so appealing as an opponent for Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Here was a challenge worthy of their combined abilities, an adversary whose defeat would bring them fame that would echo through the ages while providing Uruk with the finest building materials in the known world. The practical benefits were undeniable, but what truly motivated them was the desire to test themselves against the ultimate expression of wild, untamed power. As they discussed their plans in the privacy of the royal chambers, Enkidu found himself torn between excitement and apprehension. His years in the wilderness had taught him to respect the forces of nature, and everything he had heard about Humbaba suggested a being who embodied those forces in their most terrible and pure form. Yet he also understood that some challenges existed not to be avoided, but to be met, that growth came only through confronting what seemed impossible, rather than settling for what felt safe. Gilgamesh felt no such hesitation. The prospect of facing Humbaba filled him with an eagerness that reminded him of his younger days, before the burdens of kingship had begun to weigh upon his shoulders. Here was an opportunity to recapture the simple joy of testing himself against a worthy opponent, to engage in the kind of heroic adventure that songs were made of. The friendship with Enkidu had awakened in him a desire for glory that transcended mere personal aggrandizement, a wish to accomplish something that would reflect well upon their bond, while bringing honor to the city they both served. The practical preparations for such an expedition required months of careful planning. Weapons had to be forged specifically for combat with a supernatural adversary, supplies gathered for a journey that would take them far beyond the reach of civilization, and routes planned through territories that existed only in the accounts of traders and refugees who had glimpsed them from a distance. The royal armories worked day and night to produce equipment worthy of such a quest, crafting bronze blades of exceptional quality and shields decorated with protective symbols drawn from the oldest religious traditions. Word of their intended journey spread throughout Uruk, despite their attempts at secrecy, creating a mixture of excitement and concern among the population. Many citizens took pride in having rulers bold enough to attempt such a feat, viewing it as evidence of their city's supremacy over all rivals. Others worried about the risks their leaders were taking, fearing that the loss of both king and his companion would leave Uruk vulnerable to enemies who might take advantage of such a catastrophe. The priests of the various temples were particularly vocal in their concerns, arguing that Humbaba had been placed in the cedar forest by the gods themselves, and that any attempt to disturb the sacred trees constituted an act of impiety that could bring divine wrath upon the entire city. They performed elaborate rituals designed to determine the gods' will regarding the expedition. But the omens they received were contradictory and unclear, suggesting that even the divine powers were uncertain about the wisdom of this undertaking. Gilgamesh's mother, the goddess Ninsun, proved to be one of the most passionate opponents of the planned expedition. Her divine nature gave her insights into cosmic affairs that mortals could not access, and what she saw in the threads of fate surrounding her son's intended journey filled her with maternal dread. She appeared to him in dreams, pleading with him to abandon this dangerous quest and content himself with the safer glories of ruling a prosperous kingdom. But these divine warnings only strengthened Gilgamesh's resolve, for he had learned from Enkidu that true worth came not from avoiding danger, but from facing it with courage and determination. The friendship that had transformed him from a tyrant into a just ruler had also awakened in him a deeper understanding of what it meant to live a life worthy of his divine heritage. Safe accomplishments, however beneficial to his kingdom, could never satisfy the part of his nature that yearned for challenges that would test the very limits of his abilities. Enkidu supported his friend's determination, while privately wrestling with doubts that sprang from his intimate knowledge of the natural world's power. He had seen what happened to creatures who overestimated their abilities when facing forces beyond their understanding, and Humbaba represented such a force magnified to supernatural proportions. Yet he also recognized that their friendship had been forged through confronting the impossible, and that backing down from this challenge would represent a betrayal of everything that made their bond precious and unique. The final preparations took place in an atmosphere of mounting tension as the appointed departure date approached. Craftsmen delivered the last of their specially commissioned equipment, including massive axes designed for cutting through trees of unprecedented size, and ropes strong enough to drag the resulting timber across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Maps were consulted and revised based on the most recent intelligence from traders who had ventured into the borderlands, though none had penetrated deeply enough into the forest to provide reliable information about its interior. On the night before their departure, Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood together on the highest tower of the palace, looking out over the city that had become the center of their shared world. The lights of countless households twinkled below them like fallen stars, each representing families whose welfare depended on the wisdom and strength of their rulers. The weight of responsibility was heavy upon both men, for they understood that their quest was not merely a personal adventure, but an action that would affect the lives of thousands. Their conversation that night ranged over all the topics that had become important to them during their friendship. They spoke of the changes that had come to Uruk since their first meeting, of the laws they had established together, and the improvements they had made in the lives of their subjects. They discussed their hopes for what their expedition might accomplish, both for their own glory and for the practical benefit of acquiring building materials that would allow them to construct monuments worthy of their achievements. But beneath these practical considerations lay deeper currents of thought and feeling that neither man found easy to express in words. The quest they were undertaking represented more than an attempt to defeat a monster or acquire valuable resources. It was a test of everything their friendship had come to mean, a trial that would either strengthen their bond through shared triumph or destroy it through failure and death. As dawn approached, painting the eastern horizon in shades of gold and crimson that reminded them both of the torches that had illuminated their first battle, they made their final preparations for departure. The weapons and supplies they had so carefully selected were loaded onto pack animals, while trusted advisors received last-minute instructions for governing the kingdom in their absence. The palace stirred to life around them as servants and officials began the day's activities. But everything seemed muted and subdued, as if the entire court understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The formal departure ceremony took place in the great courtyard where Gilgamesh had once held audience as a tyrant king. Now the same space witnessed his emergence as a hero undertaking a quest that would test not only his strength but his wisdom and courage. Citizens packed the available space, while others climbed onto rooftops and walls to catch a glimpse of their rulers as they began their journey toward legend. Ninsun appeared one final time, manifesting herself in the form of a priestess to offer formal blessings, while continuing her private pleas for her son to reconsider his course. Her divine nature allowed her to see possibilities and dangers hidden from mortal perception, and the visions that tormented her showed paths leading to both glorious triumph and tragic destruction. But she also recognized in her son's determination something that transcended her maternal fears, a nobility of purpose that demanded respect even as it inspired terror. The goddess performed ancient rituals designed to invoke divine protection for travelers embarking on dangerous journeys, burning incense that would carry their prayers to the celestial realm, while marking both men with symbols that would identify them as worthy of divine assistance. Her blessings were sincere despite her reservations, for she understood that some destinies could not be avoided, only faced with as much wisdom and preparation as possible. As the ceremony concluded and the moment of departure arrived, Gilgamesh and Enkidu mounted the chariot that would carry them through the first stages of their journey. The vehicle itself was a masterwork of craftsmanship, its bronze fittings gleaming in the morning sun, while its wheels were bound with iron imported from distant mountains. The horses that would pull it were the finest in the royal stables, trained specifically for the demanding conditions they would face on the road to the cedar forest. The great gates of Uruk swung open with a sound like distant thunder, revealing the road that would lead them away from everything familiar toward a confrontation that would test the very foundations of their friendship. Citizens lined the route, calling out blessings and good wishes while struggling to contain their fears for the safety of the two men who had become symbols of their city's strength and justice. As their chariot rolled through the gates and onto the open plain beyond, both Gilgamesh and Enkidu felt the weight of destiny settling upon their shoulders. Behind them lay the city that represented all their accomplishments in peace and governance, the tangible proof that their friendship had transformed them both into better versions of themselves. Ahead lay unknown dangers that would test whether that transformation was strong enough to survive the ultimate trial. The journey to the cedar forest would take them through landscapes that few civilized men had ever seen, across rivers that had no names, and through mountain passes that existed only in the vaguest legends. They would face not only the external challenges of distance and terrain, but the internal challenges of maintaining their bond under conditions of extreme stress and danger. Every step would take them further from the safety of known territory and closer to a confrontation that would determine not only their own fates, but the legend they would leave behind. The road stretched ahead of them like a thread leading into the unknown, its dusty surface marked only by the faint traces of previous travelers who had ventured into these borderlands on missions of trade or exploration. None had gone as far as Gilgamesh and Enkidu intended to travel, and none had faced the terrible guardian who awaited them at their destination. But it was precisely this unprecedented nature of their quest that made it so appealing to men who had already achieved everything that ordinary heroes could hope to accomplish. As Uruk disappeared behind them and the wilderness opened up ahead, their conversation turned to the practical details of the journey itself. They discussed the stages of their route, the landmarks they would use for navigation, and the challenges they expected to encounter before reaching the forest itself. But underneath these mundane considerations ran a current of excitement that neither could entirely suppress, the anticipation of adventure that had drawn heroes to impossible quests since the dawn of human consciousness. The landscape through which they travelled gradually changed character as they moved away from the intensively cultivated regions surrounding Uruk. Irrigation canals gave way to natural streams, carefully maintained roads became rough tracks, and the neat geometry of civilized agriculture was replaced by the irregular patterns of wild vegetation. Each mile brought them closer to the realm where human influence ended and the older powers of the world still held sway. Their first night away from the city was spent in a caravanserai that served travelers heading toward the distant mountains. The crude accommodations were a stark contrast to the luxury of the royal palace, but both men found satisfaction in the simplicity of travelers' fare and the company of merchants and adventurers who shared the common room. These men brought news from the territories they were entering, tales of strange sights and unusual dangers that helped fill in the gaps in their knowledge, while adding to the sense of anticipation that grew stronger with each mile. As they continued westward over the following days, the character of the landscape continued to evolve. The flat plains of Mesopotamia gave way to rolling hills covered with scrub vegetation, then to more rugged terrain, where rocky outcrops and deep ravines made travel increasingly difficult. The road itself deteriorated until it became little more than a path worn by the passage of occasional caravans, forcing them to abandon their chariot and continue on foot with their supplies loaded onto pack animals. The change in their mode of travel brought them into more intimate contact with the wilderness they were entering. No longer separated from their environment by the speed and comfort of wheeled transport, they found themselves walking through landscapes that seemed to pulse with ancient power. Every stream they crossed, every hill they climbed, every forest grove they passed through carried hints of the primordial forces that had shaped the world before human civilization had begun its work of transformation. Enkidu's wilderness experience proved invaluable as they penetrated deeper into these untamed regions. His ability to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of dangerous animals, his knowledge of which plants were safe to eat and which springs provided clean water, and his instinctive understanding of how to move through difficult terrain without exhausting themselves, all contributed to their steady progress toward their destination. Gilgamesh, meanwhile, discovered aspects of himself that had remained dormant during his years of palace life. The physical challenges of wilderness travel awakened capabilities that royal luxury had allowed to atrophy, while the constant need for vigilance and decision-making in uncertain conditions sharpened mental faculties that had grown soft through reliance on advisors and servants. The king, who had once required elaborate ceremonies to mark his every action, found himself adapting to the simple rhythms of travel, sleep, and survival that had governed human existence since the beginning of time. Their conversations during the long days of walking ranged over topics that would have seemed impossible during their civilized life in Uruk. The wilderness environment stripped away many of the social conventions that normally governed their interactions, allowing them to speak more freely about their fears, hopes, and the deeper meanings of the quest they were undertaking. Each shared confidence strengthened their bond, while revealing new depths of character that neither had previously suspected in the other. The nights brought their own challenges and revelations as they made camp in locations that offered protection from both weather and potential predators. The task of maintaining fire, preparing food, and standing watch against dangers that might emerge from the darkness required cooperation and trust that went beyond anything their civilized life had demanded. These simple but essential activities created a different kind of intimacy than they had known in the palace, one based on mutual dependence for survival rather than shared enjoyment of luxury and power. As they moved further into the mountainous regions that formed the approaches to the cedar forest, the very air around them seemed to change character. It carried scents and sounds that spoke of vast wildernesses beyond the reach of human influence, of ancient trees that had never felt the bite of bronze axes, of creatures that moved through shadows cast by mountains that touched the sky. The sense of approaching something truly extraordinary grew stronger with each passing day, building anticipation that was mixed with an increasing awareness of the magnitude of the challenge they had chosen to face. Their dreams during these mountain nights grew increasingly vivid and prophetic, as if the approaching realm of divine power was beginning to influence their sleeping minds. Gilgamesh found himself repeatedly awakening from visions of towering trees that seemed to stretch beyond the visible heavens, their branches heavy with shadows that moved independently of any wind. In these dreams, he walked through corridors of living wood, where the very air hummed with supernatural energy, while somewhere in the distance echoed a voice that spoke in languages older than human speech. Enkidu's dreams carried different but equally unsettling imagery. He saw himself standing once again among the wild creatures of his youth, but now they fled from his presence as if he had become something terrible and foreign. The gazelles that had once run beside him now scattered at his approach, their eyes reflecting not recognition, but fear of a being who had crossed some fundamental boundary between the natural and civilized worlds. These visions left him questioning whether his transformation through human contact had cost him more than he had ever realized. The psychological weight of these nocturnal revelations began to affect both men during their waking hours, creating an undercurrent of tension that neither wished to acknowledge directly. They maintained their outward confidence and determination, but each could sense the other's growing awareness that they were approaching something that might fundamentally change them, regardless of whether they emerged victorious from their encounter with Humbaba. The final approach to the cedar forest required them to navigate through a series of mountain passes that seemed designed to test the resolve of any who would seek entry to the sacred grove. The paths grew narrower and more treacherous with each mile, winding along precipices that offered glimpses of valleys so deep they disappeared into perpetual shadow. Rock slides had obliterated sections of the ancient track, forcing them to find alternative routes across terrain that challenged even their superhuman strength and endurance. The weather in these high altitudes proved as hostile as the landscape itself. Sudden storms would sweep down from the peaks without warning, bringing driving rain that turned the rocky paths into torrents of mud and loose stone. The temperature dropped dramatically as they gained elevation, requiring them to huddle together for warmth during nights when their breath froze in the thin air and their water supplies formed sheets of ice that had to be broken before they could drink. Yet these hardships served to strengthen rather than weaken their partnership. Each challenge overcome together added another layer to the bond between them, creating shared memories of struggle and triumph that made their friendship more precious than any material treasure. They learned to anticipate each other's needs without words, to provide support and encouragement when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them, and to find humor and companionship even in circumstances that would have broken the spirits of lesser men. The first indication that they were approaching their destination came not through sight, but through a change in the quality of the air itself. The thin mountain atmosphere gradually acquired a richness and depth that spoke of vast forests ahead, carrying scents of cedar and pine so intense they seemed almost visible. The wind that had howled across barren peaks began to carry different sounds, the whisper of countless leaves, and the distant creaking of massive tree trunks swaying in breezes that moved through groves of unprecedented size. When they finally crested the last ridge before the forest, the sight that greeted them exceeded even their most ambitious expectations. The cedar forest stretched across the landscape below them like a green ocean, its canopy so dense and uniform that it appeared to be a single living entity rather than a collection of individual trees. The cedars themselves rose to heights that dwarfed anything in their previous experience, their trunks disappearing into a canopy so thick that no glimpse of the forest floor was visible from their elevated vantage point. The scale of what lay before them was almost impossible to comprehend. The forest extended beyond the horizon in every direction, its boundaries lost in the haze of distance and the shadows cast by its own immensity. Individual trees that would have been considered giants in any normal forest appeared as mere saplings compared to the massive specimens that dominated the central regions, their circumferences so vast that it would take dozens of men holding hands to encircle them. But it was not merely the size of the forest that filled them with awe and trepidation. There was something in the very atmosphere that surrounded this sacred grove that spoke of powers beyond mortal understanding. The air itself seemed to shimmer with energy that made their skin tingle and their hair stand on end, while sounds carried strangely through the environment, sometimes seeming to come from directions that made no sense according to the visible landscape. As they stood contemplating the enormity of what they were about to attempt, both men felt the weight of countless generations of human fear and reverence for this place. Every culture that had ever heard of the cedar forest had developed legends about its supernatural guardians and the terrible fate that awaited any who dared to disturb its ancient peace. They were not merely facing a powerful monster, but challenging beliefs and superstitions that had shaped human behavior since the dawn of civilization. The descent from their mountain vantage point toward the forest edge required careful navigation through terrain that seemed to grow more ominous with each step. The very rocks appeared different here, worn into strange shapes that suggested faces or symbols, whose meaning remained frustratingly beyond their comprehension. Springs of water bubbled up from underground sources with unusual colors and mineral tastes that reminded them they were entering a realm where natural laws might not operate according to familiar patterns. Animal life in this transitional zone between mountain and forest displayed behaviors that reinforced their sense of approaching something extraordinary. Birds flew in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, circling specific locations before disappearing into the forest depths with cries that sounded more like warnings than ordinary animal communication. The few mammals they encountered watched them with an intelligence that was distinctly unsettling, as if these creatures possessed knowledge of what awaited intruders in the sacred grove. The forest edge itself presented a barrier more psychological than physical, for the massive tree trunks stood far enough apart to allow easy passage between them. Yet something in the quality of light that filtered through the canopy above, combined with the absolute silence that reigned among the towering cedars, created an atmosphere so charged with supernatural presence that both men hesitated before taking their first steps into the shadowy realm beyond. The moment they crossed the threshold from sunlit mountainside into the green twilight of the forest interior, both Gilgamesh and Enkidu felt a fundamental shift in their relationship with the world around them. The normal sounds of wind and weather were muffled by the dense canopy overhead, creating a silence so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums like a physical force. Their own footsteps, which should have echoed among the massive tree trunks, were absorbed by layers of fallen needles so thick they sank ankle-deep with each step. The scale of individual trees became even more overwhelming once they were standing among them. Trunks rose like pillars supporting some vast cathedral, their bark scarred and weathered by centuries of growth, yet still radiating the vital energy of living wood. The spaces between these giants created corridors and chambers that seemed almost architectural in their grandeur, as if the forest had been designed rather than simply grown according to natural processes. Light filtered down through the canopy in shafts and beams that created an ever-changing pattern of illumination and shadow. These columns of golden radiance moved slowly across the forest floor as the sun tracked overhead, transforming the interior landscape from moment to moment and creating an environment that seemed alive with shifting moods and hidden meanings. Every few minutes, the quality of light would change dramatically as clouds passed overhead or breezes moved the upper branches, keeping them constantly aware that they were visitors in a realm that operated according to its own mysterious rhythms. The deeper they penetrated into this green sanctuary, the more obvious it became that they were not alone among the ancient trees. Though they saw no direct evidence of Humbabar's presence, subtle signs indicated that some powerful intelligence was monitoring their progress through its domain. Branches would creak ominously in the absence of any wind, shadows would shift without apparent cause, and occasionally they would catch glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision that vanished when they turned to look directly. The very air within the forest seemed to thicken around them as they advanced, creating a sensation of moving through water rather than atmosphere. Each breath required conscious effort, not because the air was thin as it had been in the high mountains, but because it was so rich with the essence of growing wood and ancient earth that their human lungs struggled to process its concentrated vitality. The scents that surrounded them were unlike anything in their previous experience, combining the clean fragrance of cedar with deeper notes that spoke of soil, enriched by countless generations of fallen leaves, and the slow decay of mighty trees that had stood since the world was young. Their progress through the forest was necessarily slow, not only because of the challenging terrain, but because the overwhelming grandeur of their surroundings demanded frequent pauses for rest and contemplation. The sheer age of what surrounded them was almost impossible to comprehend, for these trees had been ancient when their grandfathers' grandfathers were young, and would continue growing long after every trace of their civilization had crumbled into dust. They were walking through a living monument to time itself, a reminder that human achievements, however magnificent, were merely brief interruptions in the vast continuity of natural processes. As the day wore on and they penetrated deeper into the forest heart, both men began to experience a strange disorientation that seemed to affect not only their physical senses, but their perception of time and space. Distances became difficult to judge among the massive tree trunks, while the filtered light made it almost impossible to determine the sun's position or the passage of hours. They found themselves losing track of how long they had been walking or how far they had travelled, as if the forest was gradually disconnecting them from the normal frameworks that governed mortal experience. The silence that had seemed so oppressive when they first entered the grove gradually revealed itself to be filled with subtle sounds that required careful attention to perceive. The gentle settling of ancient wood, the whisper of needles brushing against each other high overhead, the distant trickle of water flowing over stones, and beneath it all a low thrumming that might have been the combined heartbeat of every living tree in the forest. These sounds wove together into a symphony of such complexity and beauty that both men found themselves stopping periodically just to listen and absorb the musical architecture of this living cathedral. Enkidu's connection to the natural world, though altered by his civilized experience, still allowed him to read signs and portents that were invisible to his companion. He noticed patterns in the way shadows fell across their path, subtle changes in the forest's rhythm that suggested they were being observed and evaluated by some intelligence that had not yet decided whether to reveal itself. His wilderness instincts, honed by years of survival among dangerous creatures, warned him that they were approaching the territory of something far more powerful than any predator he had ever encountered. Gilgamesh, meanwhile, found himself responding to the forest's grandeur with emotions that surprised him in their intensity. The sheer magnificence of what surrounded them awakened something in his divine nature that had been dormant throughout his years of urban rulership. Here was beauty and power that exceeded anything human hands could create, a demonstration of natural forces that made even his own supernatural abilities seem insignificant by comparison. For the first time since childhood, he felt genuinely humbled by something other than another person's strength. Their evening camp was established in a clearing where some ancient catastrophe had felled several of the giant trees, creating an opening in the canopy that allowed them to see stars for the first time since entering the forest. The fallen trunks provided both shelter and seating around their small fire, but even in death these mighty cedars retained an aura of majesty that made their temporary camp feel like a shrine to powers beyond human understanding. The night sounds of the forest were unlike anything either man had experienced in all their travels. Where ordinary woodlands came alive with the calls of nocturnal hunters and their prey, the cedar forest maintained its otherworldly silence, broken only by occasional sounds so strange and distant they might have been imagined rather than heard. Sometimes they caught what sounded like music playing far away among the trees, melodies that seemed to be created by wind moving through branches arranged in impossible harmonies. At other times, they heard what might have been voices calling in languages that predated human speech, though whether these sounds came from Humbaba himself or from other supernatural inhabitants of the grove remained unclear. Sleep proved elusive in this environment, where every shadow might conceal watching eyes and every sound might herald the approach of their legendary adversary. They took turns standing watch while the other attempted to rest, but even the sleeping man remained partially alert to dangers that conventional vigilance could not detect. Their dreams, when they finally came, were filled with images of themselves dwarfed by trees that stretched beyond the sky, of eyes glowing in shadows that moved independently of any light source, and of a presence so vast and ancient that their mortal minds could barely comprehend its nature. Dawn brought little relief from the psychological pressure that seemed to increase with every hour they spent in Humbaba's domain. The morning light, filtered through countless layers of branches and needles, created an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that made it difficult to gauge the time or maintain their sense of direction. They had entered a realm where human measurements of space and time seemed increasingly irrelevant, where their quest was being shaped by forces that operated according to logic far older and more fundamental than anything their civilization had developed. As they prepared to resume their advance toward the heart of the forest, both men understood that they were approaching the climax of their adventure. Every step now brought them closer to a confrontation that would test not only their physical courage but their spiritual strength and the bonds of friendship that had brought them this far. The monster they sought was no ordinary beast, but a guardian appointed by the gods themselves, a being whose defeat would require not just superior strength but wisdom, cunning, and the kind of perfect cooperation that could only exist between souls who trusted each other completely. The trees around them seemed to grow larger and more ancient as they approached the forest's sacred center, their trunks reaching circumferences that defied belief, while their crowns disappeared into a canopy so thick and high it created its own weather systems. Mists drifted between the massive columns of living wood, condensed from the breath of giants that had been growing since the dawn of creation, while the very air hummed with energy that made their weapons feel warm to the touch and their skin tingle with supernatural electricity. Somewhere ahead, in the deepest sanctuary of this primordial grove, Humbaba waited with the patience of geological ages for the mortals who dared challenge his eternal guardianship. The confrontation that would determine their fate and reshape the legends of future generations was drawing near with the inevitability of sunrise, and both heroes felt the weight of destiny settling upon their shoulders as they took their final steps toward a meeting that would test everything they had learned about courage, friendship, and the price of immortal fame. Deep within the ancient grove, where the very foundations of the earth seemed to pulse with primordial energy, Humbaba finally revealed himself to the two heroes who had dared penetrate his sacred domain. The first sign of his presence was not sight or sound, but a trembling that began in the deepest roots of the forest and travelled upward through every trunk, branch, and needle until the entire canopy swayed, as if stirred by winds from another world. The temperature around Gilgamesh and Enkidu dropped suddenly, their breath-forming clouds in air that had been warm moments before, while shadows began moving in patterns that defied the position of sun, filtering through the dense overhead cover. The Guardian's voice reached them before his physical form became visible, a sound that seemed to emerge from the very wood around them rather than from any single source. It was deep beyond human comprehension, resonating at frequencies that they felt in their bones rather than simply heard with their ears. The words themselves were in a language older than civilization, yet somehow both men understood their meaning with perfect clarity, as if Humbaba's speech bypassed their conscious minds and spoke directly to something deeper and more fundamental within their souls. So, the children of clay have come at last to disturb the peace that has reigned here since the world's foundation. The voice rumbled through the forest like distant thunder. I have watched your progress through my domain, mortals, and I have seen the corruption that follows in your wake. Where you have walked, the very earth recoils from the touch of beings who have forgotten their proper place in the order of creation. You bring with you the stench of cities built on suffering, of laws that serve only those with power, of ambitions that would remake the world according to your petty desires. The criticism stung both heroes, but particularly Gilgamesh, whose transformation from tyrant to just ruler had been so recent that the accusations carried uncomfortable echoes of truth. Yet it was precisely this recognition of his past failures that strengthened his resolve, for he understood that facing Humbaba represented not merely a quest for glory, but a test of whether his redemption was genuine, or merely a temporary reprieve from his darker nature. "We come not as destroyers, but as seekers," Gilgamesh called out to the unseen presence, his voice carrying clearly through the supernatural stillness. "The trees we would take will serve to build monuments to justice rather than monuments to vanity. We have learned that strength without wisdom is destruction, but wisdom without strength cannot protect what deserves protection. Grant us the chance to prove our worth through honest combat, and let our actions speak louder than our words." The response came as a laugh that shook needles from branches hundreds of feet overhead, a sound that contained both genuine amusement and terrible scorn. Honest combat? Humbaba's voice seemed to circle around them, coming first from one direction, then another, as if the Guardian moved through his domain with impossible speed. "You speak of honesty while carrying weapons forged from metals torn from the earth's flesh, while wearing armor crafted by slaves whose names you never learned. Your very presence here is dishonest, for you seek to take what was never meant for mortal hands." As the Guardian's voice continued its circling pattern, the two friends moved instinctively closer together, positioning themselves back to back, so that neither could be surprised by an attack from an unexpected direction. Their weapons felt inadequate in their hands, crafted for battles against mortal enemies, rather than for confronting a force that seemed to embody the raw power of nature itself. Yet their training and their trust in each other provided a foundation of confidence that no supernatural intimidation could completely undermine. But perhaps, Humbaba continued, his tone shifting to something that might almost have been curiosity. There is something different about you two than the others who have attempted this theft over the centuries. I sense between you a bond that transcends the usual mortal concerns with personal advancement. Your friendship has changed you both from what you were when you entered my forest. The Wild One has learned the value of civilization, while the King has discovered the importance of restraint. Perhaps you have earned the right to face me directly, rather than simply being destroyed from a distance like so many before you. The forest around them began to change as Humbaba prepared to manifest his physical form. Trees that had stood for millennia bent aside as if blown by hurricane winds, their massive trunks groaning with sounds like the earth itself, crying out in pain. The ground beneath the hero's feet trembled and split, revealing glimpses of roots so vast they seemed like the veins of some sleeping giant. Mists rose from these fissures, carrying scents of deep earth and growing things that had never seen sunlight, while the air itself seemed to thicken until each breath required conscious effort. When Humbaba finally emerged into their sight, his appearance exceeded even their most fearful imaginings. He was not simply large, but seemed to exist on a scale that challenged their ability to perceive him as a single entity. His body appeared to be constructed from the same living wood as the forest around him. Bark-covered limbs, twisted and gnarled like ancient tree trunks, yet possessing the fluid grace of a creature that had never known weakness or hesitation. His face combined human features with aspects of the wild beasts that served him. Eyes like pools of forest shadow that reflected intelligence vast and alien, while his mouth revealed teeth that could have belonged to the greatest predators of land or sea. Most unsettling of all was the way Humbaba seemed to shift and change even as they watched him, his form apparently unable or unwilling to maintain any single configuration for more than a few moments. Sometimes he appeared as a giant man covered in bark and moss. At others he resembled a great tree that had learned to move and think. His voice, when it came from this physical manifestation, carried the sound of wind through leaves, the crack of breaking branches, and the deep groan of root systems shifting in response to seasons beyond human comprehension. "Behold the guardian appointed by Enlil himself to protect these sacred groves," Humbaba announced, his words accompanied by a gesture that sent several smaller trees bending away from his presence. "I am not merely a monster to be defeated by superior strength or cunning tactics. I am the embodiment of nature's resistance to human ambition, the living reminder that some boundaries should never be crossed. Your weapons may wound my current form, but I am renewed by every tree in this forest, strengthened by every root that drinks from underground streams, sustained by powers that were ancient when your gods were young." Enkidu studied their opponent with the analytical eye of someone who had spent years learning to read the capabilities and intentions of dangerous creatures. What he saw filled him with a respect that bordered on reverence, for Humbaba represented everything he had loved about the natural world magnified to supernatural proportions. Yet he also recognized that this guardian had become something more and less than natural through his long isolation, transformed by centuries of solitude into a being that no longer fully understood the complexity of the world beyond his forest borders. "You speak of boundaries that should not be crossed," Enkidu replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived on both sides of the divide between wild and civilized. "But boundaries exist to be tested, not to be accepted without question. The trees you protect will grow again from the seeds they scatter, but the monuments we build from their wood will inspire generations of humans to seek beauty and justice rather than mere power. Is preservation without purpose truly more valuable than transformation through wisdom?" The question seemed to give Humbaba pause. his constantly shifting form stabilizing for a moment as he considered words that challenged assumptions he had held for countless centuries. During this brief hesitation, Gilgamesh acted with the tactical instincts that had made him a formidable warrior, even before his friendship with Enkidu had taught him restraint and wisdom. He launched himself forward with supernatural speed, his massive axe describing a silver arc through the forest air as he sought to land the first blow before their opponent could fully prepare his defenses. But Humbaba's reaction was faster than human thought, his bark-covered arm sweeping upward to catch the axe blade inches from his neck. The impact sent shockwaves through the surrounding trees, causing ancient trunks to sway and needles to fall like rain around the combatants. The Guardian's grip on the weapon was unbreakable, his wooden fingers seeming to grow around the bronze blade until it became part of his own structure, trapped beyond any hope of recovery. "Did you think to defeat me with the same tactics you would use against mortal enemies?" Humbaba asked, his voice carrying disappointment rather than anger. "I am not some beast to be surprised and slaughtered, but a force of nature that has learned to think and plan. Your weapons are products of human craft, limited by human understanding of how conflict should be conducted. But I fight with powers that shaped the world before humans learned to speak." As if to demonstrate this claim, Humbaba released his hold on Gilgamesh's axe and stepped backward, his form beginning to expand and multiply until the heroes found themselves facing not one opponent, but dozens of smaller versions, each possessing the same supernatural strength and speed as the original. These duplicates moved with perfect coordination, surrounding the two friends, while maintaining enough distance to prevent them from being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Enkidu responded to this new threat by drawing upon lessons learned during his years among pack hunters, creatures that succeeded through cooperation and tactical awareness rather than individual strength. He grabbed a fallen branch from the forest floor, its wood so dense and hard it felt more like stone than timber, and began using it to probe the defenses of the nearest duplicates. His movements were fluid and economical, each strike designed to gather information about his opponent's capabilities, rather than to inflict immediate damage. What he discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The duplicates possessed all of Humbaba's strength, but seemed to share his consciousness rather than operating as independent entities. When one learned something about their opponent's fighting style, all of them immediately incorporated that knowledge into their own tactics. Yet this shared awareness also created a potential weakness, for actions that affected the original Guardian's concentration would impact all of his manifestations simultaneously. Gilgamesh, meanwhile, had adapted to the loss of his primary weapon by seizing another of the massive fallen branches that littered the clearing. The improvised club felt strange in his hands after the carefully balanced bronze of his original axe, but its raw weight and reach made it potentially more effective against opponents whose bark-like skin might deflect conventional weapons. He began testing the defenses of the duplicates on his side of the circle, his attacks designed to create openings that Enkidu could exploit rather than to achieve immediate victory. The battle that followed was unlike anything either hero had experienced in all their previous adventures. The duplicates moved with inhuman speed and coordination, their attacks coming from multiple directions simultaneously, while their defenses adapted constantly to counter new tactical approaches. Yet the two friends had advantages that Humbaba's isolated existence had not prepared him to understand. Their bond allowed them to anticipate each other's movements and intentions with supernatural accuracy, creating opportunities for combination attacks that no single opponent could effectively counter. More importantly, their experience fighting as a team had taught them to think beyond immediate tactical concerns, to consider the broader strategic implications of their choices. While Humbaba focused on demonstrating his superior power through increasingly elaborate displays of supernatural ability, Gilgamesh and Enkidu concentrated on learning everything they could about his strengths and weaknesses, gathering intelligence that would prove crucial when the true climax of their confrontation arrived. The forest around them bore the scars of their supernatural conflict as trees that had stood for millennia were shattered by misdirected blows or uprooted by the shockwaves of particularly powerful impacts. The very ground cracked and split beneath the weight of forces that exceeded anything the natural world was designed to withstand, while the air itself seemed to burn with energies released by the collision of mortal determination and divine power. As the battle wore on, both sides began to show signs of the enormous expenditure of energy required to maintain such intensity of conflict. Humbaba's duplicates moved slightly less fluidly than they had at the beginning, while the original Guardian's form became somewhat less stable, occasionally flickering between different configurations as his concentration wavered under the pressure of coordinating so many simultaneous combats. Gilgamesh and Enkidu were also feeling the strain of fighting opponents whose capabilities seemed to exceed the normal limits of physical possibility. Their muscles ached from the constant tension required to match supernatural strength with mortal endurance, while their minds struggled to process the tactical complexities of a battle where conventional rules of combat no longer applied. Yet it was precisely this exhaustion that created the opening they had been seeking throughout the long conflict. As Humbaba's attention became divided between maintaining his multiple forms and continuing his attacks, his awareness of the broader battlefield began to suffer. In a moment of perfect synchronization, born from their deep friendship and countless hours of training together, both heroes struck simultaneously at the original Guardian's position, their improvised weapons converging on the point where his divided consciousness was most vulnerable. The impact of their combined assault sent shockwaves through the entire forest, causing every tree within miles to sway as if struck by an earthquake. Humbaba's duplicates vanished instantly as his consciousness snapped back to his primary form, while the Guardian himself staggered under the force of an attack that had penetrated his supernatural defenses through perfect timing and unshakable cooperation between two beings who trusted each other completely. For the first time since the battle began, Humbaba's voice carried a note of genuine surprise rather than condescending amusement. "Impossible," he whispered, his form wavering like heat shimmer as he struggled to maintain physical coherence. "No mortal weapons should be able to harm one who draws power directly from the earth itself. What force guides your blows that they can pierce defenses established by the gods themselves?" Enkidu stepped forward, his improvised club still raised, but his posture indicating readiness to talk rather than continue fighting. "The force that guides us is the same one that has transformed us both from what we were into what we have become. We fight not as separate individuals seeking personal glory, but as friends whose bond makes each of us stronger than either could be alone. Your power comes from the forest and the earth, but ours comes from something that even gods struggle to understand: the willing sacrifice of self for the welfare of another." The concept seemed almost incomprehensible to Humbaba, whose millennia of isolation had left him with little understanding of relationships that transcended mere alliance or mutual benefit. He studied the two heroes with new interest, his ancient intelligence struggling to process ideas that challenged everything his solitary existence had taught him about the nature of strength and purpose. "Friendship," he mused, the word seeming strange in his mouth as if it belonged to a language he had forgotten. "I have heard this concept mentioned in the prayers and songs that sometimes drift to my domain from the distant world of humans, but I had dismissed it as another form of weakness that mortals use to console themselves for their individual inadequacy. You suggest that two beings can become more than the sum of their parts through voluntary connection rather than forced unity. Thus concludes our journey through humanity's oldest story, a tale that has whispered its truths across 4,000 years of human experience. We've witnessed the transformation of a tyrant into a hero, experienced the birth of literature's greatest friendship, and explored questions about mortality and meaning that remain as urgent today as they were in ancient Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh reminds us that the deepest human experiences transcend time and culture. speaking to universal truths about love, loss, and the eternal search for purpose that defines our shared humanity. Sweet dreams, and may this ancient wisdom carry you gently into peaceful slumber.